Well, good afternoon. Portugal's national grid operator says that a rare atmospheric phenomenon is behind a major power outage that's affected large parts of that country as well as Spain. Footage from the Spanish capital, Madrid, shows chaotic scenes at junctions as traffic lights have been knocked out. The Spanish state railway firm, Renfe, says the outage is national. All trains have been cancelled and people have been forced to evacuate from the Madrid underground system. The national grid operator in Spain, Red Electricidad, says it's working to restore power, but it could take many hours to come back online. Well, play was suspended at the Madrid Open, forcing the game between Grigor Dimitrov and Jacob Fernley to be stopped. Scoreboards went dark and some cameras lost power. Not that one. Well, this is a station in Lisbon where the power outage to darkness underground, of course. Portuguese police say that the metro has been closed in both Lisbon and Porto too. Well, some of the cities affected by this, Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia and Seville in Spain, as well as Lisbon, Faro and Porto in Portugal. Andorra and parts of France have also seen some effects. Well, let's bring in our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, for some more on this. Afternoon to you, Tom. Good to have you here because there are some words here that you're going to need you to explain to me. Anomalous oscillations have led to a phenomenon known as induced atmospheric vibration.
Yes, it's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? And I think we should bear in mind at the moment that is information coming from Portugal's power grid operator. It hasn't yet been confirmed by the Spanish grid authorities. And I would say at this stage it is unlikely that one single event one thing might have precipitated this grid collapse, but it's likely that more than one thing went wrong. Because a power grid failure of this scale, and we're still waiting to find out how many people have been affected, but you were just listing some of Europe's largest cities there across Spain and Portugal. This is quite possibly the largest outage we've seen in Europe, maybe not in history, but certainly for a very long time. And things like that don't happen for no reason. And these grids are engineered to be as reliable and dependable as possible because they are, and I think we take them for granted while they're working. We don't realise just how much of a kind of plate spinning act keeping a large grid system, and this is a very large grid system that Spain operates across the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, some of it connected to, as you were saying there, directly to Portugal, also interconnectors to part of France, and it also supplies all of Spain's island nations as well, around the mainland Spain. It's a very, very large grid. And this is about a grid operator's worst nightmare. Not quite the worst, because what we saw at about 12:30 Spanish time was about half, based on their sort of power demand, disappear from the grid. So they've got half their power grid still working. And that's crucial because that means they've got power to put back onto the grid to help restore the balance. And it's all about balance. I'm going to come on to that in a second. But it's not a black start scenario, which is the real nightmare. And that's when you've got no power at all, even to get your power stations running again. That's something that affected Cuba, if you remember, for several weeks quite recently. So at least they've got power in Spain, but getting back onto the grid is no easy feat. And with every hour that goes by now, it gets harder. So first of all, why? Well, a power grid works, as you probably know, on alternating current, AC. It comes out of our plugs. Alternating current, though, runs at a very specific frequency. Here in the UK and in Spain, it's 50 hertz. If it drops even a few hertz below 50, 48.5, 47, things start to go wrong. Things start to trip. And the reason the frequency might either fall or rise is if there is a sudden drop in either demand or supply of power. So something's obviously happened here. There was a sudden drop or increase in power supply or demand. That could have been caused, yes, by induced atmospheric variation on a power line between Portugal and Spain. Hypothetical scenario, let's say because of that, Portugal suddenly drops off Spain's grid. That's so the entire electricity demand from Portugal goes away, frequency drops massively, then Spain's power stations start to shut themselves down to protect their turbines from spinning too fast and blowing up the power plants. So all these trips are in there to prevent that from happening. Now they've got to build that power back up. But because the grid's now off, they don't know how much demand there is out there. Who left their air conditioner on? Which hospitals are running on backup generation, which don't? That is a very difficult task to do, and what grid operators will be doing in this scenario is very carefully switching on small components of the grid bit by bit. And that involves making phone calls to people between controllers and engineers in those control rooms, and very gradually putting bits of the grid back together. Get one power plant up and running, one small area of the grid up and running, and then move on to the next one. And it can take, as the power company in Spain has indicated, the grid operator in Spain, I should say, that could take 10 hours. But things can also go wrong. You can have everything can trip. You can have another power outage, and you have to start from scratch again. Another problem, if it goes much beyond 12 hours, some people are suggesting, and this is certainly a problem that is known about, local substations that supply neighbourhoods have their own batteries to tide things over and help restart local grids in the case of power outages and make them easier to restore more quickly. Those batteries start to run down relatively quickly. If the outage continues for a while and those batteries drain, then it's even more of a challenge to get grids up and running. And just to throw this into the mix, although there's been some word out there that this is because Spain has a very renewables-dominated grid, a lot of solar and wind energy on there, that wouldn't have been the cause of a power outage because of the way these grids are integrated and the types of technology they put on there to regulate the frequency of the current. But it's true, a large amount of Spain's generation is from solar power. That will be, as the sun sets, that will be going offline. They've got less power to draw on, although it possibly could make it easier not having that supply there. But anyway, there'll be grid engineers across Spain right now sweating profusely, partly because their air conditioning's gone out, but partly because they've got a lot of work to do to try and get this very finely tuned plate spinning act of getting all of those frequencies in electricity back synchronised and in, singing like a choir all at the same note in order to get the grid back up and running.
Great stuff. Tom Clark there, our Science and Technology Editor, explaining it very clearly to us. Tom, really appreciate that. Thank you, man.